Welcome back to my channel for a video a lot of people asked for, and in this episode I will repeat the sensor testing for dynamic range, noise, high ISO I did in the past with the two Q3 cameras, the 28 and the 43 versus the Fuji GFX100RF, and I will do this in the same way as I did it in that video back then, but I will do remote shooting here. And we'll use the Sony Creators app in order to really not touch the camera. I shoot every single image except the high ISO images, of course, where I want to test for noise behavior. I will shoot all the other images at the base ISO, which is ISO of 100 on the Sony RX1R Mark III. I will shoot in fully manual mode. I will use a self-timer, and the subject for my shooting is my beautiful little Jennifer here. Look at her. Let's go back to the level meter setting here. So you see the camera is level metered. And as last time in these type of testings, I will go quickly through the procedure in a moment in the course of the video. Then I will show you the remote shooting via the Sony Creators app. And then we will run the calculations in the Python scripts I have prepared for that. And we will compare the results with what we had before for the two Q3 cameras and the Fuji GFX100RF. So really, we have quite a program ahead of us. Let's kick this off. All right, let me quickly explain the procedure in this video. It's all starting with a benchmark image or a reference image. That's what you could also say here in the upper left-hand side corner. We shoot for correct exposure by setting parameters. And we start with an ISO of 100. That's the base ISO in this example here for the Sony RX1R Mark III. f2.0, 1/100 seconds. And then we all in generate 9 stressed images. 5 which are underexposed, 3 which are overexposed, and 1 with a pretty high ISO of 25,600. And in the 5 underexposed images, we go for 1 full stop, 2 full stops, and so on, up to 5 full stops. In overexposure, we go to 1 full stop of overexposure, up to 3 full stops of overexposure. So here in this example, I shoot a stressed image with ISO 100, so base ISO f2.0, same aperture as the reference or benchmark image, but I shoot it with 1/3200 seconds, which is 5 full stops faster than 1/100 seconds, right? We have 200, 400, 800, 1600, 3200, so that's 5 full stops. In the next step, in the upper side of the slide here, in the upper half, I export the benchmark or reference image as a JPEG with 100% quality, because at the very end, we work most of the time with JPEG images. If you do a print, for instance, you will at the very end deviate from RAW. You develop the JPEG in RAW, but you export the JPEG very often. Sometimes you do the TIFF, but you know, here I just work with JPEG. And on a stressed image, before we export it, we actually correct in Lightroom via the exposure slider by 5 full stops, because that image was shot 5 full stops faster in terms of shutter speed than the benchmark or reference image, and underexposing by 5 full stops is a lot of stress injected into image. So we correct by the exposure slider. We do not touch any other sliders in Lightroom. We really want to make sure we preserve the images and focus only on exposure. So we correct it by 5 stops up. And then we also export this JPEG coming from the stressed RAW file. And both JPEGs now, the JPEG from the benchmark or reference image and the JPEG from the stressed image, they will be channeled into a Python script, and the Python script does its magic, calculating difference images, structural similarity index, peak signal to noise ratio, and all of that. And I come back to that later in the video, show you a quick run of that script. So that's the procedure we are going to do in this video. And very important, we cannot have any deviations between the benchmark and reference image in the image composition and the stressed image. That's why I shoot all images remotely, and I come also to that in a moment in the course of the video. Here's what the Python script is calculating for us, and it's all referring to the difference image between the benchmark or reference JPEG and the stressed JPEG. It's the mean square error, which is an average of squared pixel differences. It's the peak signal to noise ratio. It's the structural similarity index, which is, in my opinion, the best metric to actually pick up on visual similarity in the way of human perception. And it's the average pixel value, which is measuring the average brightness in the difference image. And I've shown these metrics all before in recent videos on my channel. I will not go into detail what they mean, but I included here a comparison table for your reference and your convenience, so you can pause the video for a moment, go through these metrics, what they all mean, and express how to interpret them, and have a look before you continue in the video. But it's all been explained already. I don't want to be repetitive here. I just assume that people watching this video are familiar with what these different metrics are expressing and telling us about the difference between a reference image and a stressed image. So I'm here in the Sony Creators app, and the first thing we need to do is establish a connection, of course, waiting for the camera response, joining the Wi-Fi network, and in this way wiring up the camera with the Sony Creators app on my iPhone. As soon as the connection is established, we can start remote shooting, and here you already see the live view. And the first shot we do is an ISO of 100, of course, 1/100 seconds, f2.0, widest open. And then we start to tweak here to 1 full stop of underexposure, 1/200 seconds, 1/400 seconds, 2 full stops of underexposure, 3 full stops of underexposure is 1/800 seconds, which I'm dialing in here. We take another shot, then we go to 4 full stops of underexposure, which is 1/1600 seconds. And again, we take the shot, not touching anything, really shooting remotely here. Then 1/3200 seconds is 5 full stops of underexposure. And that concludes our shots in the category of underexposing. For these type of tests, it's really important that you don't touch the camera, not a tiny little millimeter deviation, otherwise things will go wrong. I'm now here at 1 full stop of overexposure, 1/50 seconds compared to 1/100 seconds. Then of course 1/25 seconds is 2 full stops of overexposure, and 1/13 seconds will definitely give me the last shot in the category of overexposing. Now I want to take the high ISO shot, so I tap on ISO and increase the ISO until I get to 25,600 ISO. And on the shutter speed, I want to compensate for these 8 full stops of overexposure. But I will use a stop down aperture here, as you will see in a moment. So I can go here as fast as, I think, 1/8000 seconds. Let's have a look. Yes, but I will go only to 1/6400 seconds, which compensates 8 full stops of overexposure on the ISO side by only 6 full stops on the shutter speed side. So I will stop down the aperture now from an f2.0 to an f4.0, which are 2 full stops, and that should compensate the 8 full stops of overexposure on the ISO side, taking the shot and then of course going back to the reference image, which is an ISO of 100 and is also shot then at an f4.0 to have a like-for-like comparison. And that means I need to compensate by 2 full stops on the shutter speed side, which means I need to slow down shutter speed from 1/100 seconds to 1/25 seconds. Let's quickly wrap up what we achieved so far. So we've shot the reference image 1/100 seconds, ISO 100, aperture widest open f2.0. And the only exception where we deviated from a widest open aperture of f2.0 was for ISO 25,600. Here I stopped down to f4, but also changed on the reference side with ISO 100 to an f4.0. And we have all in now 5 stressed images. Stressed was the attribute I used in that little presentation before. 5 stressed images with respect to underexposure, 3 stressed images with respect to overexposure on both categories with full stop steps, and we have 1 stressed image with an ISO of 25,600 in order to see high ISO behavior. Next, I used the Leica Photos app to actually follow the same procedure with the Leica Q3 28 and the Leica Q3 43. And then I used the Fuji remote shooting app for the iPhone to also remotely shoot the GFX100RF. And again, I did this all in order to not touch the cameras. The slightest deviation when I shoot the reference image, and then the stressed images will already create artificial deviations in the difference image, and that's what I needed to avoid under all circumstances. Alright, I showed the procedure once, and from the 4 cameras I picked the Leica Q3-43 to show you the workflow, how to prepare these images for the signal and noise analysis. And I go first to this one here. This is basically the reference image, and shot at 1/100 seconds, f2.0, widest open, base ISO for the Leica Q3 sensor, which is an ISO of 100. And if I crop in by 100%, nice image, sharp and crisp, nice colors. And now we go to the one which is 1 stop underexposed, go into the develop section and just move that slider by 1 full stop. Next one is 2 stops underexposed, move it by 2 stops up. Next one, 3 stops, we fill it in here, then 4 stops, then 5 stops. And you see this is pitch black here, but nevertheless, there is a lot of information to recover out of the darkness. Then we have the one which is 1 stop overexposed, so we type here a -1, 2 stops overexposed, -2, and 3 stops overexposed, -3. And for the next ones, we don't have to do anything. You see here already there's a lot of noise here. That's the 25,000 ISO image, shot at an f4.0 now, so stop down. And here is the reference image, which has then an ISO of 100 and also an aperture of f4.0. And that's the difference. And that's the way I proceed. Then I go back into the library. I go into the thumbnail view. I select them all. Then I export them. And I export them into a folder on my desktop, which is called Exposure Data Read. And I have custom settings, so I just label them image 01.jpg, 02.jpg, and so on. It's always 11 images for each of these 4 cameras. And then we export them as JPEG with 100% quality, so the maximum quality, of course, because that's the file type you typically use for prints or social media or to share or whatever. And I export them all. You see here, export 11 files, and then they end up in this folder, which I named here as Exposure Data Read. And from there on, my Python script takes over, reads these files, calculates the different difference images, and automatically creates a table for me with all the values I'm interested in, like MSE, MSE in percentage, PSNR, structural similarity index, and average pixel value. Of course, you can also watch the Python script doing its thing. Let me go to play here. So this should open a console. Let me make this bigger so you see what's going on here. And it's calculating all the difference images and then all the statistical matrix I want to have on these images to fill the tables then later in Apple's number program. And you can watch this live here as it is calculating. It's not coming to an end yet, still working. You see here, now we are done. It says here below, it gives me the prompt back, which is Python. And then the Python script has done its thing, and all the information I'm looking for is available. Following the same procedure, exposure slider only, very important. For the Leica Q3-28, we get these 11 images, and following the same procedure for the Sony RX1R III, we get these 11 images. And for these 3 cameras, the parameter setting for the 2 reference images, one with f2.0, one with f4, and the parameters for the stressed images are exactly the same. For the Fuji GFX100RF, I had to follow a different path because widest open on the Fuji is an f4.0, so I cannot use f2.0. That changed the parameters for my reference image. From on the other 3 cameras, I had ISO 100, 1/100 seconds, and f2.0. Now f2.0 is 2 full stops away from widest open f4.0 on the Fuji. So instead of 1/100 seconds, I started with 1/25 seconds for the reference image. But then I followed the exactly same path, underexposing more and more, always in full stop steps, and overexposing 3 times, 1 full stop, 2 full stops, 3 full stops. And for ISO 25,600, I then went to 1/3200 seconds at an f5.6 because I had constraints on the shutter speed here in terms of how fast I could make it. And the reference image had then 1/13 seconds at f5.6 at an ISO of 100, which is the base or native ISO of the GFX100RF. And also here I did run the Python script, fully automated, reading these images, calculating the difference images, and then spitting out into Apple numbers all the statistical metrics and numbers I'm interested in. And in this way, I was then finally ready to compare them and also to come to conclusions in the evaluation of these values and the different nuances these cameras bring to the table. At the very end, I had a very clean spreadsheet in Apple numbers here, which I called camera sensors.numbers. And I was having all these values from the Python script, could compare them. I will go through them in detail in a moment. I also came up with some color coding. So the best value always was light blue. The second one was here kind of purple reddish, whatever that color is. And then also getting this all represented into some graphics where we can see what's going on. As I said, we are going through these results in a moment. And in this way, coming to conclusions on these 4 cameras. All right, let's start with the structural similarity index, which in my own humble opinion is the most important metric among the 4 metrics we are looking at here in this comparison. And the color coding throughout the presentation will remain the same. Blue is always the Sony, green is the Fuji, gray is the Q328, and amber is the Q343. And the SSI always plays between 0 and 1. That's the range where we can expect these values. And the closer they are to 1 or 100%, the better in terms of performance of similarity here. And if we contemplate for a moment what we are doing, let's say we're looking at a stressed image, 4 stops of underexposure. We are looking at the benchmark or reference image. We correct the stressed image for the same exposure as the benchmark image. And then we compare them with respect to the SSI. A structural similarity index of 100% or 1 means they are indistinguishable. And what's important to note here, and I mentioned this in my previous videos on the SSI is the metric which imitates or replicates best the visual human perception. So if you would look at the by 4 stops corrected, 4 stops underexposed image versus the reference image, you as a human being, if it is, let's say 90–95%, would hardly see any difference between the corrected stressed image and the benchmark or reference image. And that's the way we need to read these results here. Okay, so if this is clarified, then if we look at this and we are conscious that the higher the value, the better, then one camera here clearly peaks out with respect to all 9 stressed images, and that's the Leica Q328. You see always the gray bar being longer than all the other bars with respect to everything, including high ISO. And that means the Q328 performs best among these 4 cameras with respect to structural similarity index, which is 100% consistent with what I showed in my previous video on these type of metrics here when we compared the 2 Q3 cameras with the Fuji GFX100RF. But here it is, the second best performance we see with the blue bar. If we go through that, the blue bar is always the second longest. That means it's the second best performance here. And that is the Sony RX1R III, which came to me a little bit as a surprise because that camera is smaller and is also not as hyped as, for instance, Q3 cameras or the GFX100RF. Look at that. It's always the second best consistently. But we have a clear winner here and we have a clear second best. And I decided now to actually rank these with respect to 3 categories. In contrast to my previous videos. In my previous videos, I always looked at all of the 9 stressed images, and the camera which performed best in most of the stress situations was then grouped in accordingly into the ranking. This time, because these cameras behave totally different with respect to underexposure, overexposure, and high ISO behavior, I actually grouped them and ranked them within these 3 groups with respect to underexposure, overexposure, and high ISO. And if we look at the left-hand side first, for underexposure, it's the Q328, then it's the Sony, then it's the Fuji, and then it's the Q343, which again is consistent with results I presented in previous comparisons and videos. On overexposure, if you look at these numbers, I decided I don't want to do a ranking because these numbers are so close together in the second digit after decimal point that I don't think it's really meaningful to actually rank them. They are all delivering fantastic quality if you overexpose by 1, 2, or 3 full stops. And with respect to high ISO, we have kind of a similar situation as for the underexposure category. We have a number 1, which is the Q328. We have a number 2, that's the Sony. But then the number 3 and the number 4 on underexposure switched rankings at high ISO. And again, we find that astonishingly enough, the medium format sensor camera has the lowest high ISO performance, which is again consistent with what I showed in previous videos. So that's what I want to say to the structural similarity index. Let's move on to the second metric, which is the mean squared error. And here we see now really that it is meaningful to distinguish stress injected by means of underexposure, stress injected by means of overexposure, or stress coming from a very high ISO value. And I will not go in the same detail through these bars, but show you the ranking right away. But you can stop, of course, the video and stare at the bars yourself and see what your own conclusions are. But if I look at all these bars, compare them, we have on underexposure again the Q328, and the second best ranking camera is the Sony. Then we have the Fuji medium format and then the Q343. On overexposure, it changes. We have actually on rank number 1, the RX1R Mark III, then the Q343, then the Fuji medium format camera, and then the Q328. And we saw in my previous videos that the Q328 had kind of mixed behavior when it comes to stress by underexposure or stress induced by overexposure, which is again consistent with what I found in previous videos. And then on high ISO, the best camera again is the Q328, then it's the RX1R Mark III, the Q343, and then the Fuji medium format camera again has the lowest performance when it comes to an ISO of 25,000 or 25,600. And what I should have mentioned here, of course, at the beginning is, in contrast to the SSI, the structural similarity index, for the mean squared error, of course, it's worse if the value is higher and it's better if the value is smaller. And that's the way you have to read these bars, coming to a conclusion with the following rankings in the 3 different stress categories. Coming to the third metric, which is peak signal to noise ratio, again, in the same way as with the SSI and in contrast to the mean squared error, the higher the value, the better, the lower the value, the worse. And if we look at the underexposure category or to the 5 stressed images, we find again the Q328 peaking up and having absolutely splendid performance, in contrast for the same camera for overexposure, where the Q328 actually ranks last. And so on and so on. I will walk you right away through the ranking. But again, please feel free to stop the video looking at the bars. And by the way, what you see here, I come back to this later in the discussion here, it's pretty consistent behavior. All these cameras are pretty strong when it comes to this metric and comparing stress with a benchmark or reference image. And on the ranking underexposure, we have the Q328 ranking number 1, then the Sony again. And I will come back to this, but make that statement already here. I'm so surprised by the absolutely top performance of the tiny little Sony RX1R Mark III. Then third in the underexposure category is the Fuji medium format camera, and then last is the Q343. And again, as we saw before and also in my previous discussion in the previous video on overexposure, the Q343 is doing better. And rank number 1 here on overexposure is the Sony, then the Q343, then the Fuji, and then the Q328. And on high ISO, we have the Q328 ranking number 1, which is kind of consistent. This seems to be the camera which best handles high ISO here among these 4. Then we have the Sony on rank number 2 again, very strong candidate, then the Q343. And then again, worse on high ISO performance is the Fuji GFX100RF. The last metric I looked at is the average pixel value, or APV. And this is, in my opinion, the weakest of all metrics. Think about it in the way I explained it in my videos back then. The average pixel value of a difference image. The brighter a pixel is, the higher the difference between these 2 images. The darker a pixel is, the less differences you see between the benchmark image and the stressed image. And that's the way we need to depict this. So small values, lower values here are better than large values. And if we look at this in consistent ways. We see one stop under is the Q328, 2 stops under also the Q328, 3 stops under there is a battle between blue and gray here, and then on 4 stops under it's blue, and then it's again 5 stops under the gray bar. So also here in underexposure the Q328 is doing a splendid job. And number 2 is clearly here again the Sony RX1R III. Again, let me jump right into the ranking. And you see underexposure Q328, second rank is RX1R III, third again is the Fuji GFX100RF. By the way, you see there is kind of a consistent pattern coming up here in these 4 metrics, and I go and summarize everything into one shot in a moment so we get a complete picture. And the Q343 is again worst on underexposure. Overexposure, again the Q343 improves strongly to rank number 1. Then we have here on rank number 2 this time the Fuji, then the Sony, and then the Q328. And again, the Q328 seems always to perform worst when it comes to overexposure. And on high ISO, we have the consistent Q328 on rank number 1, then the Sony, then the Q343. And again, for the repeated time, the Fuji medium format performs worst on high ISO values. Now here's the summary where I actually show you all the results in one shot. And if you want to go through the 3 different stress categories, let's start with the easiest one, that's high ISO, because on high ISO there's nothing to argue. And I mentioned before a certain pattern coming out here. And you see number 1 is always, with respect to all 4 matrix, the Q328, then it's always on rank number 2, the Sony RX1R III. Rank number 3 is always the second Leica Q3. And the worst performance we always had with the Fuji GFX100RF. So there's really nothing to argue. And this can also not be by chance. All 4 matrix consistently, of course, there are relations between some of these metrics here, but all 4 point in the same direction when it comes to a clear ranking. If we look at underexposure, it's actually the same consistency we see here. The 4 cameras with respect to all 4 metrics are ranked consistently in the same order. Number 1 is the Q328, number 2 is the Sony, number 3 is the Fuji, number 4 is the second Q3 camera. No difference at all with respect to all 4 matrix, highest consistency we could ever achieve here. And then with respect to overexposure, there is a little bit light here and a little bit shadow there. And here we also have a clear ranking. Number 1 is the Sony, number 2 is now the Q343. And we saw this before when we went through the results. Then it's the Fuji GFX100RF. And the worst performance with respect to overexposure, astonishingly enough, has the Q328. So these are the results. If we put it all together here, and this video clearly was focusing on the Sony RX1R III, this tiny little camera dwarf is exhibiting an exceptional performance here among its strong peers. And every one of the other 3 cameras is more expensive than the Sony. And a lot of people complained when the Sony was announced and introduced about the price tag. But if we look at the ranking here, the Sony sensor in the RX1R III is absolutely flawless. And it's not coming at a big surprise to me. Although I said at the beginning I was, of course, astonished about the Sony performing so well, given its size. But Sony is the core competence center for sensor development, period. There's nothing to argue about that. And they really donated to its smallest full-frame sensor camera an absolutely fantastic sensor. And that's basically what this comparison is revealing here, if you look at that. In overexposure, the Sony is number 1. In underexposure and high ISO ranking, it's consistently number 2. And I think that is an interesting result, in particular for those who consider to buy the Sony RX1R III based on its size and lightweight, or for those who have already bought it. Congratulations! You bought yourself a smaller camera which keeps pace very, very well with its strong competitors from the Leica camp and the Fuji camp. Now, if we want to take this one level further, we might even say that the Sony RX1R III is the winner of this sensor competition among the full frame and medium format sensor compact cameras, because we see in two categories, underexposure and high ISO ranking, clearly the Q328 is ranked number 1. Only in 1 out of 3, namely overexposure, the RX1R III is number 1. But the Sony is number 2 in the two other categories. And if we go into the summary page I showed you before, we see that in overexposure, consistently in 3 out of 4 metrics, the Leica Q328 was actually ranking last or lowest. And that means that we have for the Sony an even more consistent behavior when it comes to sensor performance. So if we want, we can say the Q328 is the winner and rank number 2 is the Sony, or we say they are winning together, or we are completely fair and recognize that in one category, the behavior of the Q328 is not consistent at all and say the Sony RX1R III is actually kind of the proud winner, despite of its size, but with the lowest price tag among these 4 cameras of this sensor competition in the full-frame sensor and medium format compact camera camp. And of course, for me as a Leica fanboy, that hurts, right? If you look at my channel, you find tons of Leica videos. If you look into my photo studio, you find tons of Leica gear. And if you would look into my heart, you would see how close I'm with the Leica brand and all the people working for it and standing for it. But if we look at that and look at the boxes, the red boxes and the blue boxes, the Sony actually is the camera which has consistently, throughout all the metrics, throughout all the testing I did, kind of the best sensor performance among these 4 cameras. Alright, so now at the end of the video, let me put this analysis a little bit better into perspective. And what I want to say at the end of a lot of technical stuff, and I admit I have a lot of fun doing these things, and I know it also interests at least some of you to go through these statistics, you know, SSI, MSE, you know, peak signal to noise ratio, what have you. It's all very interesting and fine, and it's also brutally true. So clearly, there is no judgment going on here in these rankings. It was very clear, consistent patterns. The rankings are solid like a rock with respect to these 3 stress categories: underexposure, overexposure, and high ISO ranking. But if I use slightly different representation, for instance, for the structural similarity index, you see a very consistent behavior of these cameras. And that is something we need to bear in mind. All 4 cameras are kind of fantastic. If you look into the second most important metric, in my personal humble opinion, the peak signal to noise ratio, again, very consistent behavior of these 4 compact cameras. And my very last conclusion of this video is very simple. Yes, theoretically, there is a true ranking with respect to every of the stress categories we looked into: overexposure, underexposure, high ISO. But in real life shootings, these minor differences, they hardly matter. Look at the peak signal to noise ratio, look at the structural similarity index, very consistent behavior of all 4 cameras. And these camera sensors behave in relative terms very, very similar and perform all very well, in particular if you compare it with cameras about 3, 4, 5 years back. The Sony RX1R III, that's a conclusion clearly for those of you who are interested in buying it or who have already bought it. This camera keeps pace very well, if it's not even the winner, if you compare it with the other 3 professional compact cameras, despite its size, and by the way, for a smaller price tag. And the Leica Q328 and the Sony RX1R III, they are definitely strongest with respect to visual human perception matching between an exposure-corrected stressed image and a benchmark or reference image. But in general, image quality and sensor behavior, in my humble opinion, are nowadays hardly the true purchase decision arguments, since the performance of these cameras and their sensors will always be very similar. They are all good. And the same actually applies to a lot of other camera cams we can look into. Medium format system cameras, full frame system cameras, what have you. And I actually would recommend to everyone who has to make a camera purchase decision, decide for the camera that best matches your workflow, that matches the feature needs you have. For instance, if you want to have focus bracketing, that is only embedded in a few cameras in the world, then you need to go for these type of cameras which offer that feature. or if you want the best possible low light performance with a wide angle lens, then maybe Leica Q328 is the right camera for you. And of course, what also matters very often is brand affinity. I just love shooting my Leica SL3 system camera because I have a strong affinity to the Leica brand. And I think you should actually deviate and move away. And I see it all over the place in social media. This camera has better sensor performance. This lens has better contrast or micro contrast. Yes, in theory, it's true. But in true shooting situations, there are so many other influential factors which trigger and drive the image quality. And most importantly, the image composition is very likely what makes a good image and distinguishes your photography from not so spectacular photography. So there are many other criteria which I think we should be in favor to look at. Although it was a lot of fun, it interested me a lot to do that analysis. And I think it's also insightful, and most importantly, it produces consistent patterns of where these cameras are in some nuances better than their peers and where they are worse than their peers. And, you know, depending on your own personal preferences, but most importantly, repeating myself, your workflow, the complexity of the menu structure, what you prefer, the features, the brand affinity, that actually should trigger and drive your purchase decisions. If you liked that video, don't forget to drop me a thumbs up. Stay tuned on my channel. There is always more to come. Thanks for watching. Stay safe and healthy. And of course, peace out.